So we are Zooming Elisabeth into this meeting, live from somewhere in lockdown. She is a Commonwealth scholar with a PhD in medieval women's history from Cambridge University. She's worked with the Australian Christian Lobby, which is where I first came to meet her and see some of her work. And in fact, she published this book, Pornography as a Public Health Issue, which we have copies of. It's a pretty detailed, full-on study. And she is speaking a lot about the history of sexual rights activism, the transgender movement, feminism, comprehensive sexuality education, pornography, and the Safe Schools program, which is the Australian version of Inside Out that we have in New Zealand. Her topic is women's rights versus transgender rights. Before she joins us, she's joined us. Hello, Elisabeth.
Hello, Bob. I'll get you back for that joke one day. We'll have to, catch up.
Yeah, no, I tell you what, did you hear the joke?
I did. Oh,
Excellent.
Yes, don't worry.
It's very, very funny, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay, well, I'll hold off my video and we'll just get straight into your talk. Would you welcome, please, from, where are you?
Oh, Canberra.
From Canberra, Dr. Elisabeth Taylor.
Thank you. Okay, all right, here I go. This is, I'm going to talk today on trans rights versus women's rights. And it's a joy to join you all. I'm really sorry that I can't be there in person, but I'll try to make that up another time. So just to leap straight into this topic, at the heart of the debate about transgender rights versus women's rights are competing claims about human identity. So women's rights are based on the observable physical sex differences between males and females, and transgender rights appeal to an internal subjective gender identity as a more reliable indicator of who you really are. So women's rights demand that we observe the body, and transgender rights demand that we disregard the body as irrelevant. And because they appeal to contrary claims about the nature of the human person, the clash between trans rights and women's rights is inevitable. So today I'll be covering some of the issues that arise from the contest with regard to women's representation in leadership, women's sport, women's private facilities and prisons. But before I begin, it's probably important to explain that despite all of the marketing, transgender rights are not really about making life better for transgender people. You've probably heard all sorts of claims about transgenderism and how we need social change to accommodate the needs of transgender people. And you might have assumed from all of this that there is a group of humans who are transgender and that we can point to a set of defining characteristics that makes them different from non-transgender people. So you might be surprised, as I was when I started researching this subject about 4 years ago, to find that no such coherent definition of transgenderism exists. We hear a great many emotive arguments put forth by people who appear to be sincere in their advocacy for trans people. But when you dig into the question of who are the trans people, you get contradictory answers. So certainly we have people who do not identify with the biological sex revealed by their bodies. But what we make of this is much less certain. Is this a mental health problem? Or is there a fixed minority of the population who are born in the wrong body? Some people say that we are all somewhere on a spectrum between male and female, and still others believe that our gender identities are non-binary, meaning that they are not confined to the male-female binary. And there is general disagreement about whether gender identities are fixed for life or fluid and changeable. So these different claims about transgenderism cannot all be correct at once. And the more earnestly you look for a concrete answer to the question, who are the transgender people, the more confusing the picture becomes. It turns out that transgenderism is not one thing, it could be a number of different things. Susan Stryker, the author of Transgender History, tells us that the word transgenderism has only been in use for the last 2 decades, and its meaning is still under construction. According to Associate Professor Mary Lou Rasmussen of the Australian National University, gender is a perpetually open issue, and when we think it has been settled, we know we're on the wrong track. So in the end, the only thing that you can say with certainty about transgenderism is that no one knows what it is. And if you think you do, then you are definitely wrong. So if we can't define transgenders, then how do we argue for trans rights? And this part of the puzzle only makes sense when you realize that the actual goal of the trans movement is not a sincere wish to help a defined minority. The actual goal of the trans movement is to create confusion. We are not being invited to accept a newly discovered truth. We are being invited to doubt the beliefs about the human person that have been handed to us by tradition, and to reject these beliefs as not only wrong, but morally bad. So, according to received tradition, the human person is made up of a body and a soul, which are deeply and mysteriously interconnected. The philosophical term for this understanding of the human person as a body and a soul is hylomorphism. And the end game of the Marxist LGBTIQ+ movement is to replace the collective acceptance of hylomorphism with a different understanding of the human person, in which the most important elements of your identity are made up of your sexual orientation and your gender identity, your SOGI. I'll see if the clicker's working. I can move my slides on. Yeah, so this is where the term SOGI comes from, sexual orientation and gender identity. So please note that the SOGI does not have a body. And when you reimagine the human person without reference to the body, then all sorts of information that is written into the body suddenly becomes irrelevant to identity. And this includes your biological sex, age, and race. Male-female distinctions collapse, and so too do homosexual-heterosexual distinctions. And the basis for parental rights also disappears, because nothing about your SOGI comes from your parents. In fact, viewed through a Marxist lens, parents who try to impart their values to their children are actually guilty of oppressing their children, who should be free to explore and express their SOGI without constraint. If SOGIs do not have an age, then we cannot distinguish between children and adults. So the social consequences of rejecting information from the body as irrelevant to identity are unimaginably big, but this is the road down which trans rights takes us. There are many sincerely well-intentioned people who cooperate enthusiastically with the demands of the trans movement, but I would venture that most of them do not realize that the end game of trans rights is to dislodge the population from our Judeo-Christian foundations in order to shift us towards a SOGI-based belief system favored by global Marxists. So I'll start today by looking at on-the-ground issues that arise from the trans rights clash with women's rights. But it's important to keep in mind that this is really just a microcosm of a much bigger problem that is coming down the line. The most immediate detrimental consequences of trans rights are felt today by women and girls, but the long-term effects of this broader cultural shift will affect everyone tomorrow. So first, I'll discuss explain the meaning of gender identity and how that's shifting because we're being led from one proposition to another. And then we'll have a look at how these ideas are reflected in law and policy and some of the practical issues that arise from that clash between trans rights and women's rights. And then in conclusion, I'll return to my thesis that these issues created for women and girls are only one part of a much bigger problem. When you examine the tactics that trans rights activists use to confuse and intimidate people into cooperating with their agenda, then you see that the same tactics are being used at a population level in what amounts to a program of mass psychological manipulation. So first of all, gender identity. The concept of gender identity as something distinct from biological sex arises from the ideas of Dr. John Money, who I regret to say is one of your countrymen. And in the 1960s, Dr. John Money theorized that our internal feeling of being a boy or a girl was the product of nurture and owed nothing to nature. The gender experts are still trying to persuade us that this is true, that gender identity and biological sex vary independently. Just because you have a male body does not necessarily mean that you will feel like a man. It's not true, by the way, but postmodernists don't believe in objective truth, so a small detail like being wrong isn't going to stop them. So one suggestion is that we should think of transgenderism as something, hang on, I have to get my clicker going. One suggestion is that we think of transgenderism as something like this. Most people who have male bodies will feel like men, but sometimes a male brain might be born into a female body or vice versa. And because transgender people exist, we cannot have confidence that someone's body is a reliable guide to their gender identity. And so from there, you can just stretch it a little bit further and turn the male-female binary into a spectrum. So maybe we should think about gender identity more like this. Oh, hang on. This is the spectrum. Yeah, maybe we should just sort of stretch the male-female binary out so that we're all on the spectrum somewhere. But if so, then perhaps we're all transgender to one degree or another. But then sometimes you hear particularly young activists describing themselves as, somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, but then off to the right by about an inch. So what does that even look like? Perhaps we should think about gender identity as something like this little Venn diagram, or maybe like this. So in this version, gender identity has come to colonize everything that we used to call your personality. And if there are 7 billion people on the planet, then there are, in theory, 7 billion gender identities. So far, the gender experts have identified at least 150 for certain. And at this point, gender identity becomes so complex that they have decided just to label anything that isn't trans as non-binary. And in the land of non-binaries, anything is possible. Once you've associated gender identities with feelings rather than with bodies, then there is no reason why it can't be fluid and changeable. But the important thing to notice is that we've moved from one rule where humanity was divided into male and female on the basis of biological sex to an understanding that there are exceptions to the rule, and because some people are trans. And then we've moved to a new non-binary framework where there are no rules for anyone, everyone is non-binary, and no one can really say with any certainty what that means. So the implications of this for the law. What you think trans rights are will depend to some extent on which version of gender identity you're working with. New Zealand's Human Rights Act, for example, provides protection from discrimination on the grounds of sex, but doesn't say anything about gender identity. That doesn't mean that gender identity doesn't operate in different policies, but your law seems to be admirably backward in that respect. The UK has the Gender Recognition Act 2004, which allows people who have socially transitioned for a period of years and who have medical authority to certify that they are genuinely transgender to change their legal status and to be recognised as a member of the opposite sex. So the UK law tries to balance the needs of the genuinely gender dysphoric while still having regard to the rights of women. Australian law, I regret to say, is not nearly so sensible and provides a strong example of what not to do. Our 1984 Sex Discrimination Act was intended to give effect to Australia's international obligations as signatories to the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is CEDAW. As the Bill of Rights, this law prohibits discrimination on the grounds of sex, marital status, potential pregnancy, breastfeeding, and family responsibilities, all of which relate to the reproductive and child-rearing functions that are specific to female bodies. And because women's vulnerability to discrimination is directly linked to their biology, the sex-specific definitions of man and woman were recognised in the Act. So woman means a member of the female sex, irrespective of age, and man means a member of the male sex, irrespective of age. So far, so good. But in 2013, the types of discrimination prohibited by the Sex Discrimination Act were extended to include sexual orientation, gender identity, and intersex status. The impetus for these changes appears to have come from the Australian Human Rights Commission, which has for years agitated for the Yogyakarta Principles to be recognised in Australian domestic law. I won't explain the Yogyakarta Principles now more than to say that these enshrine a vision of the human person as a soji and therefore work against the recognition of sex-based women's rights. Not only did the revised law now protect gender identity, but this was defined very broadly. So gender identity means the gender-related identity, appearance or mannerisms or other gender-related characteristics of a person, whether by way of medical intervention or not, with or without regard to the person's designated sex at birth. It includes the way a person expresses or presents their gender and recognises that a person may not identify as either male or female. The definition is intended to apply to transsexual and transgender persons, but the definition does not use these terms, these descriptions, to ensure the definition is not unnecessarily limited in its application. So, the Australian law now protects transvestites. It protects those who legally and perhaps surgically transition, and those who self-identify, either as the opposite gender or non-binary. So unlike the UK, there is nothing in the Australian law to say that gender identity needs to be permanent. And at the same time that gender identity was added to the Sex Discrimination Act, the biological definitions of man and woman were deleted, and the explanatory memorandum tells us why. These definitions are repealed in order to ensure that man and woman are not interpreted so narrowly as to exclude, for example, a transgender woman accessing protections from discrimination on the basis of other attributes contained in the SDA. So the intention seems to have been to ensure that wherever gender identity and sex-based rights are in contest, that gender identity wins. So once you remove the biological definition of woman and include recognition of gender identity, then effectively you have changed the law to say that biological women are now only a subset of the category woman. Trans women, who are biologically male, are also women, and frankly, because you've got self-identity in there, so is anyone else who wants to join in. So the Act still includes clauses that were clearly intended to protect biological women, but these provisions no longer work very well. For example, one clause that is supposed to protect women's sport says that it is legitimate to recognise that biological differences between men and women are relevant to competitive sporting activities. And limiting this exemption to situations in which strength, stamina, and physique are relevant is a proportionate means of achieving the objective. So, sporting authorities can separate events for men and women, but because trans women are women, they have to be included in the women's sporting events. You might perhaps exclude trans women on the grounds that they are too big or too strong or too good for the women's category, but you have to pretend that they are female while you do it. So, let me get to the next slide. Hannah Mounsey, who is Australia's answer to Laurel Hubbard, was excluded from the Australian rules women's football team because he is 6'2" and weighs 220 pounds, not because he is biologically male. And Mounsey pointed out that excluding him because of his size sends a really bad message to girls with a larger physique. He said, "Think about the message that this sends to women and girls about their bodies. If you're too big, you can't play. That's incredibly backward and dangerous." So the argument sounds preposterous, but technically, Mounsey may be correct. The law can only protect women's sport by excluding some players on the grounds that they are too good for the women's category. And this, of course, runs counter to the aims of competitive sport, which is to select for excellence. When sporting clubs start kicking out the really good players, then my own rather lackluster sporting prospects begin to look up. The obvious problem when it comes to women's sport is that bodies play sport and gender identities do not. And typically, male bodies are taller, stronger, have a larger lung capacity, broader shoulders, narrower hips, lower body fat mass, more hemoglobin, and higher testosterone levels than women. So in the same way that we divide competitors by age and weight, it makes sense to divide them by biological sex, because otherwise there is no point in the contest. So even the inclusion of one or two male athletes in the women's category has a disproportionate effect in removing opportunities for women and girls. For example, in the 2019 athletic season in Connecticut, USA, two female identifying males, Andrea Yearwood and Terry Miller, won 13 out of the 14 events that they entered. And these 13 victories would normally have been shared among about 9 different girls, but these 2 boys between them were able to mop up. And the flow-on effect from junior sports is then felt at elite levels because sports scholarships that would normally have been offered to girls are redirected to natal males. Fewer women competitors getting to the elite level means fewer women moving into the leadership roles that would normally allow them to act as role models and mentors for younger female athletes. We can also expect team sports to be affected as coaches come under pressure to select those players who are more likely to win. The 2015 Iranian women's football team shows us what the future of women's team sport might look like. Apparently, all but 2 of these players are males awaiting sex reassignment surgery. So it's not an exaggeration to say that trans inclusion spells the end for women's sport. But sport is only one aspect of the disadvantage to women arising from trans inclusion. In Australia, we have been blessed with a particularly bright young senator from Tasmania called Claire Chandler, who has been highlighting the extent of the problem. And I have a short video here which I'd like to play because it really illustrates what Claire is up against. Are we able to play the video?
As the Office for Women, what definition of woman do you use?
What definition of women do we use? Could you...
Well,
maybe give us a bit more context
of course.
for the question.
You oversee and promote a range of initiatives, funding programs, specifically designated for women. How do you define what a woman is to determine eligibility for the purposes of providing advice on women's policy to government and ministers?
So, in terms of in the Office for Women, we recognise individuals who identify as women, and that's in accordance with the Australian Government guidelines on the recognition of sex and gender.
Right. On what basis do you use those guidelines to guide that decision, that policy position?
So, Senator, in terms of answering your question, as I say, we follow the Australian Government guidelines on the recognition of sex and gender. So, I guess in terms of looking at our grants program, to take an example. So, we've talked quite a bit today about the expansion of the Women's Leadership and Development program. So, in terms of the grant guidelines, it talks about the fact that those grants are there to assist women's safety, women's economic security, women's leadership, to boost women's workforce participation, to assist to keep women safe, and then in terms of the definition, it then comes back to where I started in answer to your question, in terms of us recognising any individual who identifies as a woman.
So to be clear then, the Office for Women is not focused exclusively on policies for the betterment of biological women.
Senator, I think I can only repeat what I've just said in terms of what we do is following the Australian Government guidelines.
So that clip really illustrates how recognition of gender identity works to erode the services, programs and facilities that have been designed over decades for the benefit of biological women. The potential for this situation to be exploited by opportunists is particularly obvious where there's nothing more than gender identity is required to qualify as a woman. And one example of flagrant opportunism that caught my attention a few years ago involved the 2016 elections for the Sydney University Students' Representative Council. The statutes allow for 2 representatives to be elected as long as one of them is female, or, and this had only recently been added, a non-cisgender male, which means a male-bodied person who does not identify as a man. So the space reserved for women in leadership was now being shared with other disadvantaged groups. But there was nothing in the statutes to stop 2 boys entering a ticket, as long as one of them was prepared to say that they did not identify as male. And that is exactly what happened. So here we have, whoops, sorry, we're already there. Yes, here we have Mr. Fitton, who agreed to identify as a trans woman for the purposes of getting elected. And when his success was announced, the members of the crowd were heard to shout, "Go the boys!" And one student later grumbled to the media, "He's incredibly blokey, plays AFL. They call each other the boys. It's got no basis in fact." I'm quite sure I'm wrong to find any humour in this piece of student cheekiness. I'm sure it's very disappointing for the girls who missed out on having a female to represent them, not to mention the $12,000 paycheck that went with the job. But here is the problem. How are we ever to tell if a gender identity is based in fact? There's no blood test to say whether a gender identity is real. We only ever have someone's word for it, and I don't know if you've noticed this, but some people are not very honest. So not all of the men who are keen to use the female toilets, for example, are there to powder their noses. Trans women have argued that it's not safe for them to use the men's facilities because they are quite likely to get beaten up. But it shouldn't necessarily follow that the answer to this problem is to let biological males into the ladies. Women's objections have been shushed away with a reassurance that trans women pose no threat to women, and undoubtedly many such individuals are perfectly harmless. But it is equally true that slipping on a frock opens a whole vista of opportunities to sexual predators that were previously unavailable to them. For the last couple of years, I've been corresponding with a psychologist named John Euler in the US. He spent 11 years working with sex offenders in the prison system. And John used this time to study how the psychopathic mind works. I've learned a lot from hanging out with John. One gem that he threw my way is that, as a rule of thumb, regular guys would completely understand the need for boundaries to protect women and children. So that guy who's coaching the kids' soccer team should be really happy to cooperate with the rule that says that he stays out of the girls' change rooms. The ones that push back against reasonable boundaries, the ones that shout and rage, the ones that bemoan their victimization and make you out to be the villain, well, they're the ones to watch, because the mere fact that they are completely unwilling to acknowledge the legitimacy of a perfectly rational point of view, well, these behaviours should be red flags that an undeclared agenda could be operating in the background. Of course, John spotted the trans movement right away as a predator's dream come true. He knew that any of the guys from his sex offender group would gladly slip on a frock if it would magically open the doors to the women's change rooms. Sex offenders have, without exception, steeped themselves in hundreds of hours of pornography. And apparently, when you've done that, cross-dressing begins to seem like quite a normal thing to do. So the thrill of entering women's private spaces doesn't just come from voyeurism or exhibitionism, although obviously those violations of women's privacy are bad enough. But I've also noticed certain individuals seem to get a power kick out of gaslighting their victims. They brazenly assert that predatory behaviour is entirely innocent and then direct vitriol, sometimes even threaten violence, against the person who dares to call them out. They use a claimed gender identity to flip the script and cast themselves as victims. They put their predatory behaviour right out there in plain sight, and then they tell you that it isn't really what it looks like, is it? Well, it can't be, because trans women are women, and that type of sexual predation is associated with males. So in this way, the actual violations of women's rights to safety and privacy are overlaid with a thick blanket of psychological abuse, which is intended to intimidate us all into disbelieving the evidence of our own eyes and mistrusting our own reason. That person who looks like a man is actually a woman. Your eyes are lying to you. And what looks to you like male patterned aggression is actually a projection of your own bigotry. So I'll give you some examples of how this works. You might remember Jessica Yaniv, who, identifying as a lesbian, visited several beauticians in British Columbia, asking the women who worked there to wax his male genitals. He brought charges of discrimination against a Brazilian immigrant who ran a small business from her home when she refused, and Yaniv then tweeted the righteousness of his claim. He said, "This is about businesses and individuals using their religion and culture to refuse service to protected groups." Take away Yaniv's assumed feminine persona and Yaniv's specious claims of oppression, and what you have is a man brazenly harassing a vulnerable woman, expecting her to handle his genitals, and then relishing the power to punish her when she refuses. So this is power games. The excitement for Yaniv comes at least partly from using his transgender identity as a squid would squirt out ink to obscure the picture and confound potential critics. Yaniv's behaviour should sound the alarm on many counts. He has been caught sexting minors on both Twitter and Facebook. And I have a picture here, if it were to come up, of him photographing himself in the women's toilets with young girls in the background. Posting pictures like this on social media is a way for Yaniv to brag to his buddies and to show them what he's getting away with. Because Yaniv is not alone. There are lots of men like him. I saw similar images posted by a young man who adopted a very thin feminine disguise, and he set up residence in a women's shelter, and then tweeted about how he enjoyed accidentally exposing himself to the women there, re-traumatizing women who had gone to the refuge to seek refuge from male abuse. But all you need to do is to claim a trans identity, and somehow everyone becomes so disoriented that abuse can no longer be recognized for what it very clearly is. So there are literally hundreds of cases like this. Here is Christopher Hambrook, a convicted sex offender who identified as Jessica to gain access to a women's shelter in Toronto, where he assaulted 2 more women. And here is Matthew Harks, a child predator with a strong preference for girls aged 5 to 8. He now identifies as Madeline and is legally entitled in the women's bathrooms. Here is Mark Lazarus, who cross-dresses for sexual gratification. He attempted to rape a 71-year-old woman in the female toilets. And here is Albert Weber, who goes by the name of Dee Dee, and he is a convicted child rapist who wants to be housed in the women's prison. Here is Patrick, aka Patty Lou Higgin, a 6'3", 280-pound martial arts expert. And when questioned by a woman about his presence in the female toilets, he punched out 5 of her teeth. And here is Karen White, who was jailed for gross indecency with a child who assaulted 4 more women while in a UK prison. There are currently 265 males awaiting transfer to the women's prisons in the UK. We could be here all day, but I'm sure you get the picture. Stories like this are now so common that they barely create a sensation anymore, and that in itself is a problem because it shows that we are growing accustomed to accept the abuse of women and girls as unremarkable and nothing to get agitated about. Criminologists, of course, have known for a long time that women and men have different offending profiles. And what all of these stories show very clearly is that male patterned aggression and violence appears to correlate with biological sex rather than gender identity. But woe betide the women who dare to point this out. These messages were scrawled on the windows of a rape crisis shelter in Vancouver, which insisted on only admitting biological women. The shelter has since been defunded because of its refusal to admit biological males. It was deemed to be transphobic. TERF, by the way, stands for Trans-Exclusionary Radical Feminist. And the radical feminists really bear the brunt of transgender rage because they have been steadfast in refusing to budge from their claim that women are female. If anything, I think the fury hurled against them really vindicates their diagnosis that the transgender movement is just the patriarchy in drag. It's not just that some men who claim to be women are not, in fact, gender dysphoric. Many of them are openly misogynistic, even as they claim to be women themselves. You may remember the case of Fallon Fox, a natal male who entered the women's mixed martial arts competition and seriously injured his first 2 opponents before admitting that he was transgender. And this is what he tweeted after the event. "For the record, I knocked 2 out. One woman's skull was fractured, the other not. And just so you know, I enjoyed it. See, I love smacking up TEFs in the cage who talk transphobic nonsense. It's bliss." And then don't be mad. And there's a little wink and a kiss. So you see, in the parallel universe where trans women are women, threats and intimidation against transphobes and TERFs are not only rational, but morally righteous. In this tweet that I'll show you in a minute, this tweet here, Rachel McKinnon is pins responsibility for provoking the aggression of trans activists firmly on transphobic women. He writes, "Ever met an abused animal? They're going to snap and maybe bite, but if you use that as a reason to, I don't know, kick the dog more, then you're the a-hole, not the abused animal. So yeah, expect trans people to snap at transphobia or people who support or defend transphobes." So another way of saying this would be to say, if we beat you up, it's your fault for stepping out of line. Were such veiled threats directed by a male identifying men towards a woman, then they would be instantly recognized and condemned. But only step into the world where trans women are women, and the moral compass apparently swings through 180 degrees, so that the women who are intimidated and assaulted deserve no compassion, and the male-bodied individuals who threaten violence are hailed as courageous victims. In 2019, McKinnon, who is male, set a new world record for women's cycling. He also used his Twitter account to rejoice at the imminent death of Magdalene Burns, a lesbian feminist activist who disagreed with trans participation in women's sport. As Burns lay dying of inoperable brain cancer at the age of 36, McKinnon tweeted, "It's okay to be happy, even celebrate when bad people die." And then he doubled down by underscoring his point. Well, then don't be the sort of person people are happy when you're dying of cancer. So, no, McKinnon is nothing like the poor victim of transphobic oppression that he claims. He's not even a very nice person. But he did write a PhD thesis entitled, and this made me laugh, on norms of assertion and why you don't need to know what you're talking about. And I think that just tells you a lot about the mindset at work in the trans movement. I'm not talking about genuinely dysphoric people who just want to get on and live their lives quietly. They have my every sympathy. But these in-your-face, up-your-nose activists repeatedly do this thing where they just throw an assertion out there. Trans women are women, trans rights are human rights, sport is a human right. And then they shout transphobe at anyone who might venture to suggest that a man is not a woman or that women are female. They make absurd assertions, and then the onus is apparently on us to prove that these assertions are absurd. So, as outrageous as some transgender claims may be, I want to finish by returning to my earlier point that these activists are not, I believe, the driving force of cultural change. Most people who sincerely believe themselves to be trans are simply pawns in a bigger political agenda. Others, like McKinnon and Yanev, are exploiting a moment of cultural and legal uncertainty for personal advantage. Regardless of their beliefs or motivations, the ill-defined group of people called transgender are all just grist to the Marxist mill. They represent so many human data points that elites can use to critique the status quo and argue for social change. So this is why I argue that the real agenda impelling the trans movement is not compassion for the transgendered, whoever they may be. The real objective is social change, starting with a new understanding of the human person as a soji instead of as a body and a soul. Marxism has always aimed to destroy the family unit, and now the trans movement provides the ideological machinery needed to accomplish the task of demolition. And the basic mechanism is very simple. You simply deny the significance of the body, so that the information about individual identity that comes from the body, age, sex, race, family resemblance, well, these all become irrelevant to who you really are. The abuse of TERFs, who refuse to comply with the claims of trans activists, demonstrates the techniques that are used to punish wrongthink. So anyone who dares to observe that male-female difference is important can then be called out as a transphobe. And transphobes are not only backward and unenlightened, they are mad, bad, and dangerous. Transphobes are responsible for inflicting any amount of harm on disadvantaged victim groups. The harsh treatment of transphobes serves to dissuade others from committing the same thought crimes. Inclusion of transgenders also becomes the excuse for policing language. So we're not allowed to assume that that man is a man because we'd better ask his preferred pronouns. Out of consideration for the transgendered, we need to eliminate gendered words from the language. Any words that reinforce male-female difference, man, woman, boy, girl, mother, father, sister, brother, well, these all have to go because they exclude the transgendered. Our new cultural overlords understand that, yes, words serve to communicate our thoughts, but also language shapes the way we think. So if you take away the ability to communicate about gendered concepts, then eventually people lose the ability to even think about those concepts. In the video that you might see later, there's an example of a teacher in an all-girls school who tells the girls that she's not allowed to call them girls anymore because someone is coming into the class who might be transgendered, and that will upset the status quo. So what we need to do, she says, I won't be able to call you girls anymore, even though they are all girls. And in order to make sure that she doesn't slip up, in order to make sure that she doesn't accidentally call them girls, that teacher is now going to have to stop thinking about them as girls. She will have to replace the thought girls with a genderless thought like students. Because you can only be sure that your language will not betray wrongthink if you police your own thoughts. So in a very real sense, control of language works as a form of mind control, and genderless language leads us to interact with our fellows as genderless beings. Which is why I think teaching genderless language to children in schools is a form of psychological abuse. I have another slide to show you here. This is a GP that I met a couple of years ago, and he went to the media in some alarm after conducting routine eye tests on primary school age children. You can see the eye chart that he was using. It consists of a number of pictures, and the children were asked to name the picture. he observed that they became very anxious when they got to the pictures of the boy and the girl, and they simply used the word person instead. So one girl who was aged about 7 or 8 was gently encouraged by her parents that it was okay to use the gendered words but then she went into meltdown. She had an anxiety attack and she said she couldn't say those words because she had an angry teacher. So you see how impressionable minds are being molded so that they can't say certain things, and eventually they dare not think certain thoughts. And if you keep this up long enough, eventually you end up with a population made up of people who can look at an adult man and declare that they see a woman. And you can even condition people to reflect the belief that that man is a woman in their behavior and their language. And if you can persuade someone to deny the objective reality of male-female difference, then there really isn't anything you can't persuade them to do or think or say. There's no firm ground left to which they can anchor their reason. Once we deny the evidence of our own senses and objective reality, then we've really handed our minds over to be controlled by someone else. So I'm sorry to leave you with such a ghastly warning, but I do think it is important to understand where trans rights will take us if we don't resist now. One non-binary activist who you just saw on the screen is Navo Zisson, who was a natal female. And Navo Zisson has explained that we're all really terribly oppressed by male-female gender norms. Zisson believes that we would all be much happier if we let ourselves out of the little gender boxes that we have stuffed ourselves into and indulged in the freedom that we all secretly crave to, quote, frolic in the woods wearing flowers, a dress and a beard. Zisson has a very first world view of oppression and should, I believe, spend more time reading Solzhenitsyn to get some perspective. Advancing under the banner of compassion for the disadvantaged, the marginalized, and the transgendered, the modern LGBTIQ+ rights movement is really just a rebranding of Marxism, which is a philosophy that has killed more people than any other in history. And it is being advanced by bullies. The claims of the trans movement are deliberately confusing because when people are confused, it is easy to bully them into cooperating with whatever the bully demands. We will never appease these people, and there is no reasoning with them. But we certainly need to stop cooperating with them. We need to stop policing our language and our thoughts. We need to make a firm stand on the ground of biological reality. And yes, we need to brace for a backlash. Courage is required. But a little courage in resisting the trans movement now will save a lot of heartache down the road for everyone, including for the transgendered, whoever they may be. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisabeth.